Hello fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. My name's Marissa, and today I'd like to catch you up on my reading life from before Jane Austen July, because I haven't posted a reading wrap-up in quite a while now. If you've been following my channel, you probably know this already, but I gave birth to my son on April 9th, Easter Sunday, and so I took a bit of a Booktube break in April, May, and June, and I never ended up discussing what I read in the month of March. I actually had a wonderful reading month in March. I mostly listened to audiobooks because I was very pregnant and uncomfortable, and I couldn't find a good reading position. And then once my son was born, I attempted to read but had trouble finishing anything, and so I ended up putting a lot of books down, and I only managed to finish 2 books. I have no idea how I managed to read as much as I did for Jane Austen July. I think it was in part due to me cheating a bit and starting in June, as well as a large part due to my husband carving out some daily reading time for me. Currently, my reading life is tenuous at best. I'm having trouble reading nearly as much as I used to, so hopefully I'll figure out a way to get some reading time again soon. But in the meantime, let's chat about what I did read a while back at this point. In March, I read The Treehouse Library, which is the 5th book in the Pages & Co. series by Anna James. This is a middle grade series, which is not usually my preferred genre, but this series is utterly phenomenal. It's about book wanderers, people who have the ability to travel into a book and travel through the world of story, to meet their favorite characters and observe the stories as they unfold. Story and imagination is a source of magic, and this series really highlights that. I love the strong friendships that are forged between the characters, and I also enjoy how the second half of the series switches the focus from Tilly and her friend Oscar to 2 other characters who we meet in a previous book. I know a lot of people actually don't love that choice for the series, but I think it was a really smart way to keep the series going without it feeling stale or overworked. And that's not to say that I don't love Tilly and Oscar, because I do. I think that they're phenomenal characters, but they're still present, and I think it's an interesting addition to see the focus shift away from them a bit. The one thing that I hated about this book, though, was the ending. It ended on a massive cliffhanger for the 6th and final book in the series. It was such a steep cliffhanger, in fact, that had I known how unresolved this ending was going to be, I would have waited for the 6th book to come out before reading the 5th at all. I think the 6th and final book in this series does come out very soon, though. September 14th, in fact, but I'm not sure if that's just the UK or if it's the date in the US too. The next book I read in March was Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. I had been wanting to try this author for a while now, and this book was one of the ones on my 23 books in 2023 list. And I am so glad that I did finally get around to reading this book, because I thought it was utterly brilliant. It's about a young Nigerian woman whose identity is fragmented. She is inhabited by Ogbanji, which is a concept in Nigerian culture that I looked up to try to understand better, but it's a bit complicated. It's basically the idea that mischievous or evil spirits inhabit people at birth, and their return to the spirit world is what's responsible for infant deaths. Those children who do survive infancy are often thought to bring bad luck and sorrow on their parents. Apparently, it's kind of a similar concept to the idea of a changeling. Anyway, depending on how you read Freshwater, you could view it as sort of a surreal folk tale about a woman infested or possessed by spirits, or you could view it through the lens of psychology as a narrative of dissociative identity disorder. We follow Ada's life as she grows up, moves to America for college, and copes with various traumas, all from the point of view of the different spirits who inhabit her. Interestingly, the part of the self that identifies as Ada only has about 2 or 3 pages of narrative, and she spends the little agency she has in her own story urging the reader to listen to the spirits because they are more real than she is. This book was so compelling and like nothing I've ever read before. Forget the premise. The writing itself is worth reading this book for. Emezi writes in a fascinating style that's at once very literary, but also reminiscent of oral folk tales and mythology, in that it has the immediacy of someone telling you a story. It blends these two styles together brilliantly. This book was fascinating and made even more so for me by the fact that the author identifies as trans and Ogbanji. It's unclear to me if this book is autobiographical or to what extent it has been informed by Emezi's own experiences, but the way that it explores and discusses identity was imaginative and thought-provoking and truly nothing like I've ever experienced before. I'm intrigued to learn more about the author and to read more of their work. I'd like to leave you with a quote from the book because my raving about it, frankly, does not do it justice. All the madnesses, each and every blinding one, they can all be traced back to the gates, those carved monstrosities, those clay and chalk portals, existing everywhere and nowhere and all at once. They open, things are born, they close. The opening is easy, a pushing out, an expansion, an inhalation, the dust of divinity released into the world. It has to be a temporary channel, though, a thing that is sealed afterward, because the gates stink of knowledge. They cannot be left swinging wide like a slack mouth, leaking mindlessly. That would contaminate the human world. Bodies are not meant to remember things from the other side. There are rules, but these are gods, and they move like heated water, so the rules are softened and stretched. The gods do not care. It is not them, after all, that will pay the cost. I also read Circe by Madeline Miller on audiobook in March. This is one I had wanted to read for a while as well. I had previously read and loved Song of Achilles a few years ago at this point. I liked it so much, I think, that I did an individual video on it a while back when I did more videos on individual books. So I'll link that down below if you want to check it out. But anyway, I also saw Madeline Miller speak at the Brooklyn Book Festival a few years ago as well, and I think she's a phenomenal author who I wanted to read more from, and so I finally did. Circe is the story of Circe, a very minor character from the Odyssey known as the Island Witch who turns men to pigs. But Madeline Miller takes this little character bio and turns it into an incredible coming-of-age story. Circe is a lesser goddess, daughter of the sun titan Helios and the nymph Perse. She does not possess any talents or powers and is eclipsed in the shadow of her more remarkable siblings. She doesn't even seem like much of a goddess with her mortal voice. It's only when she is banished to the island of Ayaya and discovers her talent for pharmaca and witchcraft, and especially the art of transformation, that she truly comes into her own. This book is a profound exploration of power dynamics between the greater gods, lesser gods, nymphs and mortals, between the Titans and Olympians. It delves into what it means to be human or what it means to be immortal, how the gods actually embody the worst of humanity and don't respect each other or the mortals that worship them. It depicts gods that thrive on vengeance and violence and torture and only listen to shows of strength and power and threats. The book is also a beautiful coming-of-age story that depicts themes of motherhood, love, and relationships, and mortality. But I was really struck with how well Madeline Miller was able to portray a variety of different characters and stories, all while making Circe the star. This book also tells the story of the Minotaur, the fall of Icarus, Medea, and other snippets of the Odyssey, and yet none of these overshadow Circe's story. In short, Madeline Miller turns Circe's life into its own epic. Side note though, while I love this book, I do not recommend reading it right before giving birth like I did. It has some pretty disturbing and terrifying birth scenes that I had to work really hard to mentally overcome. I also listened to this one on audiobook, like I said, and I thought that the audiobook narration was brilliant. My only complaint about it was that the writing was so compelling that I would have written down lots of quotes had I read it in print form. Even so, I was able to find a bunch of my favorite quotes online, so I'll leave you with one of my favorites before moving on. Cersei is speaking about her relationship with Daedalus. In a solitary life, there are rare moments when a soul dips near yours, as stars once a year brush the earth. Such a constellation was he to me. I was so enamored by Cersei that I was desperate to see if Madeline Miller has written anything else. She's only written the 2 novels, Song of Achilles and Circe, as far as I know, but she also wrote a short story called Galatea, which I read right after finishing Circe. Galatea is a reimagining of Pygmalion, told from Galatea's point of view. A sculptor has formed the most beautiful, perfect woman from stone to be his wife. He expects her to be submissive and obedient, but she wants to assert her independence, so he keeps her locked up and supervised round the clock by doctors and nurses, but she's never been more determined to escape and rescue her daughter. Madeline Miller creates a complex and interesting, fresh perspective in the character of Galatea. The story is beautiful and impeccably written, as all of Madeline Miller's work seems to be, and it bridges the gap between mythology and the modern world in a thoughtful and dynamic way. My only complaint with Galatea is that it's a short story and not a fully fleshed out novel. I feel like the author could have done so much more with this story, and reading it felt like a teaser trailer for a longer work that will never come to fruition. Still, if you're a fan of Madeline Miller or interested in the story of Pygmalion, I highly recommend this one. And the last thing I read in March was The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. In March, I read a lot of books that I had been meaning to read for a long time but hadn't gotten around to, and this was one of those. I love Taylor Jenkins Reid as an author, but I hadn't read one of her most famous works until now. And this might actually be my new favorite Taylor Jenkins Reid book. Actually, I'm rather indecisive as to whether I prefer Daisy Jones and the Six or this book, and I still haven't read a few of her backlist books, but The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo was just phenomenal. At 79 years old, the famed Hollywood icon Evelyn Hugo is finally ready to come out and open up in an exclusive all about her glamorous and scandalous life. But she'll only give the exclusive to an unknown junior magazine reporter named Monique Grant. Even Monique is stunned. Why will Evelyn only share her story with Monique? And which of her 7 husbands was the love of her life? I think this book epitomizes what Taylor Jenkins Reid does best. She writes about and explores the concept of fame in a way that I've never seen anyone else do before. She makes her characters feel real, but in a different manner than I've previously encountered. She gives them a real cult of personality. She makes me feel as though they really exist in pop culture, as if they are some famous person I've simply never heard of before and should probably go look up and Google. I came away from Daisy Jones and the Six wanting to listen to Daisy Jones's music, and at various points in this book, I wanted to stop reading and watch Evelyn Hugo's old movies, which, of course, don't exist. But this book is so brilliant in that it both builds Evelyn Hugo up as a pop culture icon and reveals the real and complex internal workings of the character behind that facade. And the real Evelyn Hugo is quite the character. But the brilliance of this book isn't just the character of Evelyn Hugo and the push and pull of the relationship between her and Monique. The plot and structure of this book is fantastic. It reads almost like a mystery. You're in constant suspense as to why Evelyn is telling Monique, of all people, her story, and you're also in suspense as to the details of that story. You're propelled forward at a lightning-fast pace by the desire to unearth Evelyn's secrets and to know why Monique is worthy of this exclusive. But at the same time, you're tempered by the clear structure of the book. Evelyn goes through her 7 husbands, one by one, and there's a sense of stability and security in knowing that her story won't end until she finishes telling you about all 7 of them. This book is just fantastic, and I know that there is a lot of hype around it, but I really think it deserves every bit of it. So like I said, my March reading was phenomenal. And then I had a newborn, and reading was very difficult. I read a few pages of Kitchen by Banana Yoshimoto in the beginning of April, but Then I gave birth and I didn't pick it up again. The bookmark is still in here. I also tried reading Leave It to Psmith. I know there's a P, it's silent. The book makes it very clear. By P.T. Wodehouse, which is the second in the Blanding series. I got about halfway through. The bookmark's in there still, I think, as well. And I was enjoying it. It's hysterical, but it also felt a bit slow and stilted somehow. I do kind of want to revisit the very eccentric character of Psmith, but yeah, the plot is incredibly convoluted and not the easiest to explain, but suffice to say, it involves mistaken identities, a plan to steal a necklace, and bad poetry. I do think I want to go back and finish this one, and I should probably do so before I forget all of the details of what's happening in the plot. Then I started Haroun and the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie, which I also didn't finish. Salman Rushdie is an author I've wanted to try for a while, and this was a short book that I thought I'd be able to get through easily. However, I started listening to it on audiobook. I listened to the first chapter and I decided it was so good that my husband and son and I should listen to it as a family. So we tried to, but then my son became colicky around week 2, maybe 3 of his life, and he started screaming for hours on end, and we simply couldn't listen to anything. We actually wore earplugs around the house. Yes. So eventually the audiobook returned itself, and we never picked it up again. I think we might have also lost the speaker that we were listening to it on. Anyway, it's a very imaginative children's book about a celebrated storyteller who suddenly loses his talent for telling stories. His son, Haroun, in a quest to reclaim his father's gift for storytelling, is thrust into an adventure traveling across the sea of stories. It read like a fairy tale and reminded me of Alice in Wonderland in all the best ways, and it has a ton of wordplay and literary and pop culture references. The book has layers and layers of wit and meaning, some of which I certainly didn't get. It's supposed to be in conversation with Arabian Nights, which I'm not familiar with, and I think a lot of the character names have significance in multiple Middle Eastern languages. It's all about the value and importance of stories and imagination, especially in the face of authoritative regimes and censorship. From what I read of it, the book is quite powerful on its own, but has an even deeper meaning when you realize that Rushdie wrote it for his son when the author had to go into hiding after the controversy and the death threats surrounding the satanic verses. Anyway, Haroun and the Sea of Stories is definitely a book I should revisit and actually finish one day. And if it's anything like Rushdie's other work, he's an author that I really should read some more of. If you are a Salman Rushdie fan, where would you recommend starting after I finish Haroun and the Sea of Stories, of course? And then in my postpartum haze, I read The Postnatal Depletion Cure, a complete guide to rebuilding your health and reclaiming your energy for mothers of newborns, toddlers, and young children by Serrallach. This book was recommended to me by a doula, with the caveat that she hadn't read it yet, when I was a month or so postpartum and I started experiencing some potential symptoms of nutritional deficiencies. The book was written by a doctor in Australia who routinely treats postpartum women using functional medicine. The book lays out protocols for successful postpartum recovery to replenish a mother's energy, body, and sense of self, and combat intense fatigue and exhaustion, symptoms of forgetfulness, low energy, lethargy, moodiness, and a general sense of drowning in the overwhelming nature of motherhood. If you're interested in nutrition, this book is actually a fascinating read. It discusses the nitty-gritty details of macro and micronutrients our body needs to function properly, and what happens when we don't get enough of them or have too much of them, as well as various hormones and how they function. It even lays out detailed diagnostic protocols and examples of patients he's had and how he's treated them. But as interesting as this book was, I found that it mostly made me frustrated and angry for many reasons. I felt like the most important and interesting advice in here is completely unactionable in today's healthcare system. I think it would be next to impossible to find a doctor in the US who would run all the tests this author recommends and who would really take a look at your nutrient and hormone levels. Maybe a specialized functional medicine doctor who doesn't take insurance would do it, but the average doctor in the US simply doesn't practice this way. The system isn't set up for it, and their training is based on a completely different mindset. I actually highly recommend this book if you're in healthcare, especially if you're an OBGYN, general practitioner, or anyone really who treats postpartum women. It sheds light on a different way of approaching a situation that is typically overlooked by Western medicine. But for your average reader, there are probably better postpartum books out there, and probably better postpartum books that aren't written by men. Because while I enjoyed learning about various nutrients and hearing how many women experience this depletion, I couldn't get past the overtly sexist statements and views on everything from lack of libido after birth, to the differences between men's and women's sex drives, to the discussion of women's bodies and, quote, losing the pregnancy weight, to the phrase, women need to let go of their need to control. And it drives me crazy because the concept of postnatal depletion and the medical approach the author lays out is important and should be taken seriously by healthcare professionals. But it's hard to take something seriously when it's surrounded by outdated sexist sentiments and language. Anyway, I could go on a further rant about this and the healthcare system in general, but I'd rather talk about books, so let's move on to the next one. The last book I finished before July was The Story of English in 100 Words by David Crystal. I love learning about linguistics and etymology and the history of the English language, and this is a phenomenal book for all of those interests. Most books about these topics either take the approach of discussing historical time periods and how the English language came to be and how it's shifted through history on a broad scale, or they delve into very specific etymologies of various words. This book is unique in that it tries to take both approaches at once. The author picked 100 words whose etymologies he felt best exemplified trends in the evolution of English throughout history. And then he used his selected words as starting points to discuss larger topics and themes. I quite enjoyed the structure of this book and thought it was very well done. Plus, it was interesting to hear which words the author selected and why. I learned all about the origin of my middle name in the section about place names, which was fun, and I enjoyed the discussion about weird silent letters in words, like the B in debt or the P in receipt, and how they were added later in the 16th century to make everything seem a little more Latin. Apparently, the L in fault was originally silent like this, and in the 18th century, it was sometimes pronounced and sometimes not, so that fault actually rhymed with thought. So, fought? Anyway, I knew that most words in the English language come from French and Latin, but there are also some interesting Persian etymologies that I wasn't aware of, like scarlet, lilac, and caravan. I also find it interesting how many different acceptable spellings there were before codification and globalization. I read this one on audiobook, and I had some issues with the narrator's pronunciation of certain words, mostly Yiddish words or words relating to Judaism. I also think this would have been better in print because I wished I could see all of the different spellings that he was describing instead of hearing them spelled out. Another thing I noticed about this book is that the author is from the UK, and occasionally he would state a word or phrase that is popular in the US, which I simply disagreed with or had never actually heard before. Overall, though, this is a fun book and full of interesting tidbits of history. The book was fascinating, and I could go on and on about random little details and facts that it taught me about the English language. Or you could just read it for yourself if you're as interested in this type of stuff as I am. So that's all I have for you guys today. You are now officially all caught up on my reading life. If you've read any of these books or plan on reading these books, I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. If you have finished the books that I started and put down, do you think that they're worth picking up again? I do, but I want to hear from you too. Hopefully, I'll be able to get my reading back on track and carve out some daily reading time again. Right now, it's a bit hard because the free time that I have, I want to spend with my husband and just be together and do things together. And reading has taken a bit of a back seat. But hopefully I can get that habit going again because I really miss my reading time. So until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another video very soon. Bye!